Welcome, everyone. My name is Zoe Weil. I am the co-founder and president of the Institute for Humane Education, and I'm so glad that you have decided to watch this solutionary webinar. So I'm going to share my screen for the duration of our time together. So we need solutionaries, and I wrote the book, The Solutionary Way, Transform Your Life, Your Community, and the World for the Better. And this webinar is going to offer you the ideas and the tips and the solutionary process from the book so that you can embark on your own solutionary path. So this webinar has 3 parts: what it means to be a solutionary and why it matters, foundations for a solutionary mindset, and an overview of the solutionary framework. So part 1, what it means to be a solutionary and why it matters. So to begin, I am going to ask you a question. In relationship to what's happening in your community, country, and/or in the world, are you feeling anxious, frustrated, angry, occasionally despairing, some other negative emotion? If you are, that's not surprising. If you want to create a world where everybody can thrive, and by everyone, I mean people and animals and the ecosystems that support life, it can be incredibly frustrating to see all the ways in which people and animals and the environment are not thriving, and worse, are suffering and subject to increasing harms. And yet, a better world is possible. And believing this is important as motivation to help build that better future. Now, the reason that I believe that a better future is possible is because I have seen how many positive changes have happened in my own lifetime. I was born in 1961, and when I was born, more than half of the people in the world lived in extreme poverty. Less than 40% had access to electricity. In the US, discrimination based on race was legal. Fires were breaking out on US lakes and rivers, and smog and soot coated US cities. Women were only just beginning to aspire to careers beyond teaching and secretarial work and nursing. Gay, lesbian, and trans people were mostly closeted, and a relatively small percentage cared about the plight of animals. Today, fewer than 10% of the people in the world live in extreme poverty. More than 90% have access to electricity. Discrimination based on race is illegal. Overall, the water and air are cleaner in the US. More girls than boys attend college in the US, and the vast majority of girls around the world go to school, and gay, lesbian, and trans rights are encoded in laws. And the great majority of people believe that animals should be protected from cruelty. Now, I'm not trying to paint a rosy picture, but to remind us that things can be bad and better. A lot of problems. Around 800 million people still live in extreme poverty. Structural racism persists, and bigotry is far from being vanquished. Microplastics and agricultural runoff are polluting our waterways, and ocean dead zones are proliferating. Air pollution is extreme in many megacities around the world and is also increasing with wildfires. Hard-won rights are being rolled back, and animal cruelty is more widespread than ever because of the increase in meat eating. And climate change is happening even more quickly than many predicted. With that said, we need to pay attention to what's gotten better, because if things can get better, they can become better still. So they will become better as more of us become solutionaries and build a more just and humane and sustainable future. So what exactly is a solutionary? Someone who identifies unjust, unsustainable, and inhumane systems and transforms them in ways that do the most good and the least harm for everyone. Again, people, animals, and the environment. Now, as you can surmise from this definition, a solutionary is not the same as a problem solver. Somebody can solve the problem of damming a river or blowing up a mountaintop for coal removal, but they are not solutionaries because embedded in the very definition of being a solutionary is this ethical imperative to do the most good and the least harm for everyone. A solutionary is also not the same as a humanitarian. Humanitarians relieve suffering. But humanitarians are not focused on addressing the causes of suffering and harm. They are there to help after it happens. Now, obviously, we need humanitarians, and we also need solutionaries so that problems don't persist. Basically, being a solutionary is being a next level change maker. So, how do you become a solutionary? Mahatma Gandhi was once asked by a reporter, "What is your message?" And on that particular day, he'd taken a vow of silence. So in response, he jotted down on a piece of paper, "My life is my message." Now, when I read that, I was struck by its universality. I thought, if Gandhi's life is his message, that means that my life is my message, that in fact, all of our lives are our message, whether we like it or not. So then the question becomes, are we modeling the message we most want to convey? And that is a part of the process of being a solutionary, because if we want to make sure that we are worthy of being listened to as we solve problems, we want to make sure that we are modeling our message to the greatest degree possible. So one way to go about this is to embrace the 3 I's of inquiry, introspection, and integrity. When we bring our inquiry to the choices we make and then introspect to see how that new information aligns with our values, we are able to live with greater integrity. Now, the 3 I's are not a how-to. They are not going to give you the right answer. They don't make it easy to make your life the message you want it to be, but they make it possible. Moreover, the investigative and thinking processes that go into using these 3 I's will help you cultivate the skills that will serve as foundation for solutionary thinking and action as well. Now, to illustrate the process of using the 3 I's, I'm going to tell you about my 11-year journey to align my values with my choices in regards to food. And yes, I did say 11 years. And the reason that I'm sharing this story with you is because it was a long process between my initial inquiry to when I truly felt that I was living in alignment with my values in regard to my diet. Now, I know not everybody is going to relate to this example, but my hope is that you can relate to the idea that some of the most meaningful transformations in our lives only happen when we have a commitment and we have humility to inquire about the impacts of our choices and self-reflect as we gain new information and make new choices to live with greater integrity. So when I was a young teenager, I was a huge fan of the television series Star Trek. This is me in my room back in 1975. I was so obsessed with the show that I even asked William Shatner, who played Captain Kirk on the original series, to kiss me in front of 5,000 people at a Star Trek convention when I was just 15 years old. Now, this photo with William Shatner was taken in 2012. And not only did I not get that kiss when I was 15, I still have not gotten that kiss. But I tell you this to share that Star Trek wasn't just entertainment for me. It shaped my thinking and my values, including around the food I ate. So in one episode, Mr. Spock, the logical Vulcan on the original series, introduced me to the concept of vegetarianism. Now, Spock was a vegetarian not because he loved animals, as I did, but because he thought it was illogical to cause pain and suffering to animals for no other reason than because one liked the taste of them. So Spock planted this seed in my mind, but it took a few more years for that seed to sprout. So later in high school, I met a sheep at the Children's Zoo in Central Park in Manhattan, and I began visiting him every week. And I named him Willie Baba. There he is. And whenever I'd arrive, he'd come running up to the fence when I called his name to greet me. I loved Willie Baba. I also loved lamb chops. In fact, lamb chops were my favorite food. So I tried really hard not to make the connection between Woolly Baba and lamb chops. But one day I couldn't pretend that I did not know who I was eating. And so I told my mom that I was thinking about becoming a vegetarian because I loved animals and I didn't want to hurt them. But no sooner had I said that than I added, but I guess they're already dead, right? So it doesn't really matter. Now, my mother did not want me to be a vegetarian, so she did not explain the laws of supply and demand or invite me to consider that when I ate meat, I was simply paying somebody else to do something I would never do myself, which is kill an animal for my pleasure. And I didn't make the effort to discover this obvious truth either. So more years passed when I didn't engage my inquiry to learn more. But then in college, I finally did bring my inquiry to my food choices, and I did introspect more deeply, and I decided to become a vegetarian. But to me, being a vegetarian did not include not eating fish. Somehow, I didn't consider fish to be animals, or at least not animals who could feel and suffer, which we now know categorically is not true. They can feel and suffer. So it took another 8 years for me to examine my thinking in this regard, and I only did so when I was on a whale research vessel in Alaska, and we were expected to catch the fish that we eat. And even though I didn't really want to fish, I really couldn't think of a good excuse not to. So I ended up catching a fish that I was told was a trash fish, and I was told to throw the fish back. So that fish had been dragged on a hook, uh, pulled out of the water where the fish couldn't breathe, and then manhandled to get the hook out and thrown back, hopefully not to die anyway. And then meanwhile, the fishes that people had caught that were, quote unquote, not trash and were going to be our dinner, they were flailing in a bucket, slowly suffocating to death. Now, while I hadn't intended to bring my inquiry to the impact of fishing, the experience became a powerful teacher. Once again, I introspected, and with new information based on my experience, I decided to stop eating sea animals too. Now, I'd heard about vegans, people who not only didn't eat animals, but also didn't eat dairy products and eggs, but that seemed a step too far for me. I assumed that cows and chickens weren't mistreated or killed for these products. After all, they'd had to be alive to produce milk or eggs and presumably healthy. And so for a long time, I just didn't pursue learning more. But I was in for quite a wake-up call when I did decide to bring my inquiry once again to learn. And what I learned challenged my assumptions quite a bit. But then I wanted to see if whether what I was reading and watching in undercover videos was really true. So I brought a group of students to visit the biggest egg producing facility on the East Coast of the United States. And this facility had 500,000 hens, crammed into cages so tightly that they could never stretch a wing. And their sensitive beaks had been severed when they were newly hatched chicks to prevent them from pecking each other to death in this extreme confinement. We could barely breathe for the short period of time that we were there because of the ammonia fumes from the accumulated waste from these chickens who had to breathe those fumes every day of their lives for the year that they were going to be there. And after that year, they were so spent, they were no longer able to produce eggs. And so they were sent off to the soup factory across the river and slaughtered for food. So I took these photos and I promised myself that I would teach others about what I had learned. Now, as for dairy products, I learned that cows were artificially inseminated and that when their calves were born, those calves were taken away on their first day of life, and that the cows would sometimes bellow out for days when their young were essentially stolen from them. And if their cows were males, they would not grow up, obviously, to produce milk. So they were usually sold off for veal production. And sometimes they were sold for specialty milk-fed veal. And so those calves were chained at the neck in tiny stalls, unable to take more than one step forward or back for the duration of their 4-month lives, after which they would be forced by electric prods to walk on their atrophied limbs to a truck to take them to slaughter. And I took a group of students to see a facility for ourselves. And the reason you're still looking at chickens instead of looking at those calves is because they would not let me take any photographs or any video. Now, meanwhile, what was happening to those calves' mothers? They were being forced to produce up to 10 times the amount of milk that they would normally produce for their calves, and that would often result in mastitis, a painful udder infection necessitating antibiotic treatment. At that point, it was about 50% of cows would wind up with mastitis at some point during their lives. And then, of course, when they were too spent, they would be sent off to slaughter to become hamburger or pet food. So I introspected some more and I decided to become vegan so as not to support these industries. And it made it a lot easier to look a cow or a chicken in the eyes with love and kindness and know that I was not harming them. So that was in 1989. And the lessons that I learned from the process of continuing to ask questions and introspecting and aligning my choices with my values still deeply inform the work that I'm doing today. Now, as I said at the outset, embracing the 3 I's sounds simple, but it asks a lot of us, as I hope my story conveys. Now, each of our journeys toward greater integrity is going to look different based on our own lines of inquiry. Diet was one line of my inquiry. Maybe it will be for you, or maybe you'll be examining your ecological footprint or asking how you're putting a commitment to service and generosity into practice, or being an engaged citizen, or inquiring about the impacts of your product choices or your clothing choices on others. Whatever your lines of inquiry, I invite you to use the 3 I's as a foundation for being a solutionary, because walking our talk matters. Okay, now we're going to move on to part 2, foundations for a solutionary mindset. While living in alignment with our values is important, both for our own integrity and so that we aren't perceived as hypocrites, it's just the first step. That's because entrenched systems won't change solely through our personal choices. We need to develop a solutionary mindset. So what does that look like? So there are 3 questions to ask yourself as a burgeoning solutionary. The first is, what problems most concern you? What are you good at? And what do you love to do? And if you can find the place where the answers to those 3 questions meet, your life will become ever more meaningful and purposeful, and I venture to guess, joyful. So I invite you to ask yourself these 3 questions and really ponder them. Sometimes it's hard to know what we're good at. Our society tends to judge us on certain qualities. When we're kids, we discover whether we're good at math or science or reading or writing because those are measured in school. We may also discover we're good at sports or music because these are also valued. But there are so many other things that we could be good at. We could be good at staying equanimous in difficult situations, at being a good listener or a compelling storyteller or an out-of-the-box thinker. There are so many things that we could be good at. We also need to pay attention to what we love to do, because connecting what we enjoy doing with what we're good at and Focusing these on what concerns us is a recipe for being joyful, successful, and effective as a solutionary. So I've been taking improv classes for about 20 years, and one of the things that I have learned is that the rules for improv comedy are some of the best rules for being a solutionary. So I'm going to share 3 of those rules for you. The first one is to build relationships. So what do I mean by this? Well, imagine 2 improv actors stepping onto the stage. Now, the first thing that they are going to do is establish a relationship. One actor might start off by saying, "Hey, Mom, I've entered us into the parent-child acrobatic competition at school." So that actor just established a relationship with their scene partner by calling them Mom. Now, why is this so important in improv comedy? Well, if there is no relationship, the actors won't know how to interact with each other, and the scene won't move forward, and the audience will likely not enjoy themselves. Now, in our regular lives, building relationships is essential too. Doing so helps us care about each other, listen carefully and compassionately, work together, and communicate more effectively. When we don't build relationships, all this may suffer. Just look at what happens when people write comments on others' posts online from the privacy of their computer screens. These comments are often more hostile and aggressive than if they were actually interacting with the person in real life. That's because there's no relationship. Now, it's pretty easy to build relationships with people who think the way we do and care about the things we care about. But if we want to be solutionaries, we need to build relationships with people who don't think the way we do and who have different concerns and perspectives and ideas. And when we build those relationships, then we are more likely to be able to build bridges across divides that prevent us from solving problems. If we don't build those bridges, it's really hard to solve problems. As soon as we do, it becomes possible. Now, the next rule in improv comedy is to embrace the concept of yes and. So imagine those 2 actors again. After the first actor has said, "Mom, I've entered us into the parent-child acrobatic competition at school," their scene partner might respond by saying, "That's fantastic, Brian. We can finally wear the pink polka dot leotards that I purchased on eBay." So essentially what that second actor did is they said yes to the role of mom, and then they added the "and" by talking about the pink polka dot leotards. Now, this concept of yes and is really important for improv comedy. Imagine what would have happened if the second actor had said, "I'm not your mom and I don't do acrobatics." The scene would have had nowhere to go. That can happen in our lives as well. When we disagree with someone, implicitly saying no to their ideas, there's nowhere to go either. But when we can say yes to others' perspectives and then add to them with our "and," we can move toward new ideas based on conversation and collaboration. So what does yes and look like in real life? Well, I'm going to give you an extreme example. And by extreme, I mean I'm going to take a really polarizing issue and share how we could find a yes across our divides. And that issue is abortion rights. So how can someone who is pro-choice and someone who is pro-life find a yes and? Well, people who are pro-choice and people who are pro-life can both agree that it would be great if as few girls and women faced an unwanted pregnancy as possible. Now, while finding that yes does not mean that they are going to agree on the issue of abortion rights, it does mean that they have found a place where they could potentially find solutions together by adding their "and," which represents ideas for how to achieve a goal that they could both agree on. Now, the last improv rule that I want to mention is bring the love. In improv comedy, actors are always bringing the love, meaning that they are not trying to create conflict on stage. They're trying to create loving relationships because that is more fun and generally funnier to watch. Now, how does that apply to being a solutionary? So imagine yourself driving on a highway going 65 miles an hour. And imagine that there are a lot of cars on that highway, and they're all driving too. And everybody is driving safely. And you're all getting to your destinations because you are tending to the traffic and being careful and safe. And now imagine that somebody cuts you off and you have to brake suddenly, and you have this adrenaline rush and you're really mad, understandably. Maybe you slam on your horn. Maybe you feel like you want to flip them a bird, but you control yourself, but you really want to. Again, all that understandable. So here's my question for you. Before that person cut you off, were you feeling loving toward all the people who are driving beside you 65 miles an hour, carefully, safely, so you're all going to get to your destination? Probably not. It is so easy to be quick to anger, but it's less easy to bring the love moment to moment, day to day. But if we can bring the love as often as possible and really try to appreciate each other, we are going to be better solutionaries. We're going to be more likely to assume goodwill and approach problems as solvable through collaboration. So the next metaphor I want to mention to you is to strive to be a campfire rather than a forest fire. So what do I mean by this? So imagine a clearing in the woods where there's a beautiful and warm campfire. And picture people surrounding that fire and their faces are glowing. There's nowhere they'd rather be. Now, imagine what happens if too much fuel is added to that fire and sparks begin to fly and sparks ignite a tree. And suddenly, this beautiful campfire turns into a wildfire, and everybody is fleeing this forest fire. What does this have to do with us? Well, we each have a fire inside of us. It's the fire of our passions. It's what we care about. It's what we want to change in the world. And how we strive to be a campfire that draws people close so they want to learn from and collaborate with us matters. How can we avoid becoming a forest fire, which burns out of control and pushes people away? So some of us are more innately fiery than others. For example, I tend to have a fiery personality, and some people don't have much of a fiery personality at all, and they could benefit from having a little more fire in order to engage with others and inspire them, just like I can benefit from having a little less of a fiery personality. So what determines the fiery temperament we have is in part our personality, but it's also the fuel that we put on our fire. Now, if we are fueling ourselves with constant information about atrocities and suffering and destruction, we may be adding so much fuel that we start to get really fiery and perhaps enraged and despairing, and we may inadvertently push people away. Now, the reverse could be happening too. If we don't put fuel on our fire in the form of information about what's happening that needs to change, about systems that are unsustainable and unjust and inhumane, we may not have the motivation or any fire in our bellies to take steps to make a difference. So to follow the metaphor one more step, it's also possible that we may have burned so hot for too long that we have burned ourselves out. So as you think about your personality and your tendencies, consider that the fuel that you need to be a campfire, adding just the right amounts of fuel to find that sweet spot where you burn just right, both for your own benefit and to make your solutionary efforts as effective as possible. And consider other sorts of fuel other than information, like the fuel of getting enough sleep and enough exercise and eating healthy foods and having loving relationships. All of these forms of fuel help us to burn just right. So the next step in cultivating a solutionary mindset is to approach problems as solvable and avoid either or binary framing, which is so common in our society. When we have a solutionary mindset, we're always looking for underlying problems and steering away from getting drawn into artificial debates. So I'm going to give you an example of what I mean by this. Years ago, I was driving in my car and I was listening to the radio, and I heard about an upcoming debate that was going to be held at New York University. And the debate question was whether or not the United States was responsible for Mexico's drug wars. And I remember being pretty startled by the debate topic and thinking it seemed such a simplistic either or framing. I thought to myself, if you're going to gather experts to talk about an issue as complex as Mexico's drug wars, wouldn't it make more sense to gather experts to talk about how we can solve this problem, looking at the complex systems that underlie it, like poverty and lack of access to education and opportunity? Or perhaps experts could come together to offer solutions to the problems of drug addiction and drug abuse. But instead, this event was going to gather experts to debate a fabricated either or statement, with the audience voting on the winner. And I found myself wondering, what is the goal of such an exercise? This kind of either or framing is so persistent in our media and in our politics that we often get caught up in it and fail to carefully examine the underlying problems and the systems that perpetuate them with the goal of solving those problems. And then we tend to gravitate toward a side, which leads to greater polarization and away from solutionary thinking. So the next thing that we want to do is to practice solutionary thinking. Now, solutionary thinking is comprised of many forms of thinking, but primarily critical thinking, systems thinking, strategic thinking, and creative thinking. Now, these forms of thinking are not sequential. However, when we're learning to be a solutionary, critical thinking is foundational. Without good critical thinking, we can't become good systems thinkers. And without good systems thinking, we can't become good strategic thinkers. And while creative thinking is going to be helping us all along, when we get to the place where we are ready to innovate solutions, we want to make sure that our critical systems and strategic thinking have been honed so that we bring that creative thinking to bear on solving problems effectively. So, how do we develop this mindset and these thinking skills? That's what the solutionary framework is all about. And that brings us to part 3 of the webinar. The solutionary framework is a 4-phase process in which we identify a problem, we investigate it thoroughly, we innovate a solution, and we implement that solution. So 4 more I's to add to the 3 I's of inquiry and introspection and integrity. Now, in phase 1, we select an issue that we want to learn more about. And it should be something that we're concerned about, but we need more information on it in order to determine the specific problem that we want to solve, a problem within our sphere of influence and that makes sense for us. And at the end of phase 1, we'll write down our problem statement. So that might sound a little wonky, like, why do we need to be so specific? Well, the reason is because we want to make sure that we are choosing a problem that's feasible to address and which makes use of our best skills. So let's say the problem we most care about is climate change or poverty or animal cruelty. We may be passionately concerned about this big problem. We may have learned a lot about it, but we ourselves are not going to be able to solve climate change or poverty or animal cruelty. But if we identify an aspect of this problem that is within our sphere of influence to solve, that utilizes our talents and is aligned with our interests and is something we know we can connect with others to address, then we can make a substantive difference that leads to bigger and more far-reaching impacts. By writing down our problem statement and making sure it's within our capacity to address, we're ready to take the next step. So in phase 2, we're going to connect with everybody we can who has a stake in the problem, including those working to solve it, as well as those benefiting from the problem and the systems that perpetuate it. Now, if the problem that we are addressing is an environmental problem or an animal cruelty problem, we're not going to be able to talk to trees or animals who are the obvious stakeholders, but we can talk to those who have been advocating on their behalf. Now, the next thing we want to do is to make sure that we understand the root and systemic causes of the problem. This phase is called investigate because that's just what we're going to do. We're going to research the problem thoroughly so that we understand its causes and learn what has succeeded and failed in solving it so far. And that word solve is important because we don't want to take a Band-Aid approach. For example, let's say that the problem we want to address is litter in a nearby park. We could clean up that litter every week for the rest of our lives, but we will not have addressed the causes of the problem. Or let's say that the problem is hunger in our community. We could drop off food at a food bank, but the problem of poverty that leads to hunger would persist. Now, of course, it's wonderful and important to pick up litter and to donate food, and we should do these things. But as solutionaries, our work addresses the root and/or systemic causes of the problem so that it no longer persists. It's when we get to phase 3 that we are ready to innovate solutions, starting by looking for leverage points where a change will have far-reaching positive impacts. Remember that as solutionaries, we seek to solve problems in ways that do the most good and the least harm for everyone, people, animals, and the environment, and have the fewest unintended negative consequences. In other words, we want our solutions to actually be solutionary. So let's go back to the issue of hunger again. Perhaps one idea that we have is to ensure that people have the capacity to produce food in their own communities. This is an idea that has led some nonprofit organizations to solicit money to provide animals to people living in poverty to use in farming. Now, as solutionaries, we need to ask ourselves if this solution does the most good and the least harm for everyone. It may be helpful to the people who need food, but the solution doesn't take into account the impact on the animals being donated or the long-term impacts of animal agriculture. In other words, it's not doing the most good and the least harm for everyone. Now, during phase 3, the sky is the limit on ideas, so brainstorm all of them and write them down and entertain them, and then determine which are the most solutionary. This graph can help. The vertical axis asks us to consider how well the solution avoids unintended negative consequences for people, animals, and the environment. And the horizontal axis asks us how well the solution addresses deep and/or systemic causes. The more that we are finding solutions that are highly solutionary on the graph, the better. Now, to be clear, we don't have to innovate a brand new solution. Perhaps others have solved the same problem in a different context or in a different place. There's no need to reinvent the wheel if we can implement someone else's great solution in our own situation. Now, when you have your most solutionary solutions, the next step will be to determine which is the best for you to implement. Some fantastic ideas may simply not be feasible for you or make the best use of your skills and interests, but share those ideas with others and then choose the solution that makes most sense for you. Next, you'll need to plan for implementation. What are the action steps? Who are the individuals involved? What are the resources that are needed? What's your timeline? What are the potential challenges? And what are some ideas to address those challenges? After completing your chart, you're ready to implement your solution, which brings us to phase 4. Implementing your solution, assessing it, and iterating to do better. We really want to be honest in our evaluation of our solution. Did it work? No matter our answer, we'll want to share what we learned. If it didn't work, we want others to know how they can avoid pitfalls. And if it did work, we want others to know so they can replicate our idea. And finally, we want to celebrate our efforts and our learning. Please don't forget this part of the solutionary process. Now, to really dive into the solutionary process in detail and learn how to use the framework effectively, and this is a shameless plug, I hope that you will get my book or take it out of the library. It's going to provide you with a lot more details than I can give you in this webinar. So if you want to purchase the book, the publisher is offering a 30% discount for those watching this webinar, and you can use this QR code for that discount, entering Solutionary30 at checkout. I am imagining you coming to this concluding part of the webinar and perhaps thinking, this is a whole lot of work. I'm not sure I'm up for this. So here's my pep talk. Being a solutionary is good for you. It's not just good for your community and for the world. It will bring meaning and purpose and incredible people into your life, and it will be heartening and rewarding to see the solutions come to fruition that make a difference. This is a picture of students who came from North America and Central America to attend our summer retreat at our campus in Maine to explore how to be humane educators who teach about the interconnected issues of human rights and animal protection and environmental sustainability so that other people can become solutionaries. And just look at the joy on everyone's face. That is because this is joyful work, and it becomes a positive feedback loop for hope as well. As Professor David Orr said, hope is a verb with its sleeves rolled up. So that's my pitch, to roll up your sleeves and become a solutionary, because what we do now echoes in eternity. So I'm going to close with a visualization. So I invite you to close your eyes and take a few deep breaths. And I'd like you to imagine that you're very old and approaching the end of a long and well-lived life. Picture yourself sitting on a park bench on a beautiful day. The air is clean, waterways around you are clean, birds are singing. There hasn't been a war in many years. Nobody goes to bed hungry. We have learned to treat each other and other species with respect and compassion. And now imagine a child coming up and joining you on the park bench, a child who has been studying history in school and learning about much darker times. And the child wants to know, how did everything change? And so the child asks you lots of questions. And then the child asks you a final question. What role did you play in helping to bring about this better world? What did you do? How will you answer that child's question? What will you say that you did? Okay, now open your eyes. So I hope that you will answer that child's question in the days and the weeks and the months and the years to come. And please know that we at the Institute for Humane Education are here to help you along the way. Please visit our website, humaneeducation.org, where you'll find the solutionary framework, you'll find our blog, activities and lesson plans to bring to others, videos, and an online humane education community that you can join, as well as online graduate programs with our partner, Antioch University. A better world is possible, and it is worth building together. Thank you so much for watching this webinar and for all that you already do and all that you will do. It matters so much.